Unlike other scientists who are dependent upon institutions and paychecks, Guy is free now to tell the whole truth regarding abrupt climate change. And I think that's a very important point to make. So without further ado, please give me help me with a warm welcome for Dr. Guy McPherson.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks especially to all of you for showing up and staying as long as you have. Oh, wait. Sometimes when somebody comes in late, I say, no, it's no big deal that you're late. It's not like it's the end. Oh, wait. If you can advance the slide, please. In fact, I'll just go like this. I'll just wave at you or something. If there's an asteroid coming at Earth and it's going to destroy all habitat for humans, I want to know.
The object is on a direct collision course with us. We are under 11 G's exterior acceleration and have no control whatsoever.
And some people don't want to know. They don't want to know that there is an asteroid. They don't know when the asteroid is going to hit. They don't want to know anything about the asteroid at all. But some of us want to know, and I'm one of those people. And it has become clear in the relatively recent past that asteroids are nothing compared to climate change in Earth's history in terms of extinction events. So what really drives major extinction events is abrupt increases in temperature, not the abrupt decreases in temperature associated with asteroids. And we're in the midst of an abrupt rise in global average temperature. Next slide. People accuse me frequently of having no hope. I plead guilty. I have no hope. There, I said it. I feel like Bill Hicks when he's talking about coming out in a Boy George costume at a Klan rally. Hope is viewed as unimpeachably good in this culture, but I'm with Nietzsche on this one. Hope in reality is the worst of evils, for it extends the torments of man. And were not such a misogynist, you might have included women in that statement too. Hope is the other side of the coin that has fear on the one side. We can't predict the future. We hope for a better outcome, but we don't take agency. We fear an outcome, but we don't take agency. Hope is wishful thinking. Hope is hopeless. That's not to suggest I don't promote action, because I do. Quoting Edward Abbey, the desert anarchist and longtime writer in Tucson, Arizona, action is the antidote to despair. And what better judge of our character than how we treat those or how we act in the face of overwhelming odds? If you know you're going to lose, if you are the underdog and there's no hope of winning, if you're the Mary Williams Academy for the Blind junior high girls football team and you're playing the Seattle Seahawks, then why not give it your best shot? What better judge of your character than how you show up when there's absolutely no hope? Oh, I have a video here and there's no sound associated with the video, so I'm going to provide it. So let's go ahead and start this 1-minute clip that tells the whole story. So she's having a baby. I've seen this a couple of times. I know how it goes. Real quiet. And then once he opens his eyes, wait for it. He's got a lot more wind than I do. Not bad if I do say so myself. If at any time you feel compelled to do a standing ovation, don't let me stop you. That was the best voiceover I've ever done. So really, that's the whole story. Life is short. I don't know about the second half. I suspect the Dalai Lama would say play more. I would say live more. But in any event, life is short. Even if you live to be 100 or more, it will seem rather short. Ooh, that's an interesting icon. Next slide, please. All right. I'm gonna consider the possibility. No, let's not call it a possibility. I'm going to consider the 99.99% likelihood that humans are going to go extinct in the very near future. I'm going to bracket the time over which I think that could occur. There have been no humans on the planet at 3.3 degrees Celsius above baseline in the past. Baseline meaning the beginning of the Industrial Revolution or approximately 1750. So we're headed for more than 3.5 degrees above baseline in the not too distant future. And it doesn't sound like much, really, but 3.7 degrees above baseline is more than 105 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's like going from 98.6 to 105.5 degrees Fahrenheit in a short period of time. When that happens, there's no more habitat in your body for the good things that keep you alive, and there's a whole bunch of habitat for the bad things in your body that kill you. So if you experience a rapid rise in temperature to 105.5 degrees, and it stays there for even a relatively short period of time, you don't survive. Earth has a fever. And Earth is headed for a fever that's really, really high, higher than has ever been experienced by humans at any time in the past. Human extinction will result not because we're not clever, we're very, very clever. We misnamed ourselves. We called ourselves Homo sapiens, the wise ape, when I think a far better name would have been Homo calidus, the clever ape. It's not that we're not clever, it's that there won't be any habitat for us. And already we're seeing profoundly important examples throughout the world of habitat being lost, including for humans. Just within the last 24 hours, there have been reports about the aquifers drying up all over the planet. Sao Paulo could run out of water by the end of the month. The snowpack in California, for the first time ever in the Sierra Nevada, 0%. That was in May. Summer hadn't even started. We don't get along very well without food and water. Even the slow rise in global average temperature we've experienced so far on this planet is outstripping the ability of organisms to catch up, to keep up by 10,000 times. So climate change, even this slow linear rate of change we've observed so far, has occurred 10,000 times faster than organisms can keep up. As a consequence, a really big consequence, this is from the journal literature a week ago, suitable days for plant growth are disappearing even at that relatively slow linear rate of change. And we're headed for a much, much more abrupt global average rise in temperature in the very near future. I don't know your expiration date. We put an expiration date on everything, and it actually makes sense for some things, like eggs. You know, that we grow them in these big CAFOs, these controlled animal facilities, which are horrible for all concerned. And then we put them in refrigerated trucks for 6 months or so, and then they show up at the grocery store and they say they expire next week. And so maybe I can go with you on that one, that there should be an expiration date. But on canned goods or medicines, the expiration dates are almost always intended to do sales, not to do safety. On the other hand, I don't know when your expiration date is. This is the one we really need, is the expiration date on us. And we don't get one. Right? You don't show up stamped on your foot with the day you're going to die. It'd be really handy if you did, because then you know exactly how much of your retirement to save. Right? You spend it down until you got 1 penny left on your last day. Oops, only 1 penny left. Can't have my last cup of coffee. So I don't know your expiration date. People ask me this all the time. Really, seriously, people come up and ask me when they're going to die. And the obvious answer that comes to my mind is, I can help you. We can make that today if you want. But nobody's interested in that. I don't know. I don't know. I'm pretty sure of when we're going to run out of habitat for our species, plus or minus a few years. But I don't know what that means for you as an individual. And nobody else knows either. I'm going to start by pointing out a variety of conditions that could lead to loss of habitat for humans on this planet within 18 months. So that's the short end, is about 18 months. I'm not suggesting that these events will happen. I'm not predicting that they will happen, with an exception here and there. And I'm also not saying that humans will go extinct, but rather that there will be no more habitat for human animals on the planet. I have no doubt that some people will last a little bit longer by storing a bunch of food in a bunker, a bunch of food and water, and being able to persist a little bit longer, months, maybe even years, than the rest of us. But that's not habitat, and I would argue that that's not living. That's dying a little more slowly. So, we're in the midst of an El Nino. It looks like a big one. The last two big ones were in 86, 87 and 97, 98. And as was typical, there's 10 or 12 years between them. Now it's been almost 20 years since the big one in 97, 98. The ocean is a battery. The ocean stores a lot of carbon dioxide and it stores a lot of heat. During an El Nino event, the ocean gives up a lot of that heat. And the last time it gave up 0.15 degrees centigrade of heat. So I think it's safe to assume that we're going to add 0.15 degrees centigrade to the extant nearly 1 degree global average rise in temperature we've experienced since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Then, at some point in the future, and it certainly could be this year, and many people are making this prediction, I'm not, just to be clear again, but it could be that we can no longer manage to sustain the unsustainable as of this year. It could be that civilization, all civilizations go away. It could be that this least sustainable of civilizations, industrial civilization, falls this year. If that's the case, then within a matter of days after termination of civilization, there will be a global average temperature rise of 1.2 plus or minus 0.2 degrees Celsius, according to a paper by James Hansen and colleagues from 2011. Now, two subsequent papers have demonstrated the conservative nature of this paper, with the latter one indicating that only a 35% reduction in industrial activity could produce a 1 degree centigrade temperature rise. Only a 35% reduction in industrial activity. Well, why is that? Industrial activity produces reflective particles. In addition to producing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and methane in the atmosphere that traps heat, industrial civilization also produces reflective particles, the most well-known of which is sulfates that come from burning poor quality coal, high sulfur coal. And those sulfates go up into the stratosphere and reflect the sun. It's called global dimming. There was an excellent documentary on BBC about 10 years ago about it. So when that umbrella is gone, when the sulfates fall out of the sky, they're constantly falling out of the sky. We only keep the umbrella up there because we're constantly adding sulfates up into the sky. It's a matter of days after ceasing industrial activity before we experience a very rapid rise in global average temperature. In addition, one of the other adverse consequences of the collapse of industrial civilization in less than, say, 50 years or so is the catastrophic meltdown of the world's 440-some nuclear power plants. When asked about 2 years ago by a citizen journalist, how long will it take to decommission Indian Point, the nuclear power facility outside of New York City, Dave Chasko, the most recent ex-head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission of the United States, said, it'll take 60, and then he backpedals, or 50 years once we have the money available and begin decommissioning that one nuclear power facility. Earlier today, I saw a report that a Mylar balloon, you know, one of those cute little toys kids get, kids of all ages, for their birthday, went up into the electrical lines, caused a full-scale shutdown of Indian Point, Scram. So apparently the terrorists come in the form of 8-year-olds with balloons now that are capable of shutting nuclear power facilities down. So this is going to be inconvenient, to say the least, when industrial civilization falls. And we can't sustain the unsustainable forever, obviously. And we haven't properly prepared by decommissioning nuclear power facilities And that takes a lot of money, and there's no money to be made in it. So there's not a lot of activity in that direction. But that's really kind of a bummer, so I want to move on and talk about abrupt climate change instead, which is so much more exciting and fun. It could also be that we have an ice-free Arctic this September. It's never happened in human history, but we're headed that way. This is 2015 right there compared to every year, and you can see that for the last few months, the ice extent in the Arctic has been at an all-time low. The U.S. Naval Postgraduate College did an analysis a few years ago predicting that the ice would be gone in 2016. The Arctic Methane Emergency Group gives it a 20% chance of happening this year. It looks like it is actually a higher probability than that. If the current trend continues, we could have an ice-free Arctic. And if that happens, and I'm not predicting that it will happen, but it certainly could happen, then the 50 gigaton burst of methane, Natalia Shakova, field researcher in the Arctic for the last decade or so, warns is highly possible at any time could actually come out of the Arctic Ocean. And that will produce a 1.3 degree centigrade global average temperature rise. It takes about a year for methane to be completely distributed around the globe. So the northern hemisphere will experience the impacts first, and then it'll go all around the planet. So it could be that the current global average temperature rise above the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which is commonly accepted as being 0.85, but the recent data, or data I've seen within the last 2 days, suggests that it's really 0.96. But what I'm doing here is being quite conservative with each of these numbers. So probably this is closer to 0.96, but we'll stick with the scientific consensus of 0.85. And I think there's going to be at least 0.15 degree global average temperature rise as a result of the ongoing El Nino event. And so that takes us to at least 1, and perhaps higher, in the near future. And then we tack on collapse of industrial civilization. Again, I'm not saying it will happen. I think it's conservative if it does happen that we'll have a 1.4 degrees global average temperature rise in a matter of days resulting from that. And then if in addition we get the 50 gigaton burst of methane Natalia Shakova warns about, then we're at 1.3. And it could be each of those is off by 1/10 of a degree, in which case we're at 4 instead of 3.7. 3.7 is still a half a degree higher than we've ever had humans on the planet before, with 3/4 of the temperature rise occurring in about a year and a half. Remember, already the slow rate of change is outstripping the ability of organisms to adapt by a factor of 10,000 times. Let's ratchet that up to more than 250,000 times and see what happens. I just don't see very many plants surviving that. Already the phytoplankton in the ocean, the base of the marine food web, and half of the food humans eat is on the verge of total loss. So, on the other hand, it could be that 4C is the number, or higher. It used to be 4 degrees C. Up until 2008, there was a general scientific consensus that humans will go extinct at 4 degrees centigrade above baseline, even though we've never had humans on the planet at more than 3.2 degrees above baseline. But once it became obvious that 4 degrees was locked in, it's guaranteed based on carbon dioxide alone, and the most recent voice to join that party is Shell Oil Company. In their New Lens perspective, released a couple of weeks ago, they point out that 4C is locked in the near term, 6C in the long term. Since it's become obvious that 4C is a given, climate scientists have said, well, then we're going to survive that. Probably extinct at 4.5. And then once 4.5 is locked in, they move back a little further. The goalposts keep shifting backwards. So I don't know at what point humans go extinct, because we haven't run this experiment. We're still here. We haven't gone extinct yet. But given that we need habitat just like every other organism, I don't see much potential for habitat for humans in the not-too-distant future. Oliver Tickell, in his August paper in The Guardian, summarizes the scientific consensus at the time, 2008, as 4 degrees C. That's when we go extinct. But because of the shifting baseline in the last 7 years, that number apparently has been thrown out the window. And it's not because we're not clever, it's because of the energy coming out of the ocean and produce superstorms that have the capacity to level cities. It's because we have the great Dust Bowl version 2.0 in the middle of every large continent. It's because we don't have plants. And what happens to livestock in the absence of plants happens to humans in the absence of plants too. We're the livestock in that picture. I'm going to talk about one of the many self-reinforcing feedback loops we have triggered on the climate front. These are events that feed upon themselves, the snake that eats its tail, as it were. I'm going to talk about methane coming out of the Arctic Ocean, the first of these self-reinforcing feedback loops that was reported in the journal literature, and therefore the one that we know the most about. The firing of the clathrate gun is the phenomenon James Hansen worried about in his 2007 book, Storms of My Grandchildren. And it appears that, ironically, 2007, the clathrate gun was fired. Clathrates are chemical cages around methane molecules, and when warmed, the chemical cage breaks open and the CH4, methane, we know it as natural gas, is released directly into the water column as shown here, or into the atmosphere. So this was first reported in the journal literature from August 2009 and subsequently reported in many other places. It took until 2012, a little over 3 years, for Tim Jennings to report it in the journal Global Policy, that methane coming out of the Arctic Ocean was one of several self-reinforcing feedback loops that have been triggered and that they're irreversible. So science is slow to catch up to reality. About a year later, NASA's CARF project reports direct observations in the Arctic Ocean of methane plumes up to 150 kilometers across. So you're in a sailing ship, you're in the middle of one of those plumes, and all you can see in every direction is an ocean that looks like it's boiling as the methane is coming pouring out. Based on that one self-reinforcing feedback loop, climate scientist Paul Beckwith at the University of Ottawa concluded in late November last year that we can expect a 5 to 6 or maybe 10 degree temperature rise in a decade or two. No humans at 3.3 or higher above baseline in the past. These are big numbers. And I think it's far more likely we will observe 10 than 5 or 6. After all, there have been 2 relatively stable states in Earth's history in the past. There's been Ice Age, which has persisted for tens or hundreds of thousands of years, and there's been Jurassic Park, which has persisted for tens of millions of years. And there have been very few relatively stable states in between, and the transitions from one state to another are quite abrupt. So we're right here, right now. This is today, us with the asterisk there on the right. And sure, the temperature has stabilized briefly in the past at about 5 degrees above the Ice Age in the past, and about 10 degrees above Ice Age in the past. But it hasn't stabilized at the point Paul Beckwith uses in his example. And Beckwith, a paleoclimatologist, points to events such as the one reported in the October 2013 issue of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States, in which there was a 5-degree global average temperature rise in 13 years. So we can experience these rapid changes in temperature, rapid rises in temperature that most organisms cannot keep up with in a very short period of time. In fact, some have pondered the notion of Earth going Venus. Instead of stabilizing at those previous relatively stable positions, it could be that we'll manage to boil away the oceans and create conditions in which life cannot persist on this planet. The rationale for this kind of statement is that Earth is a lot closer to the sun than we imagined. I mean, we've always known how far, well, not always, but for a while, we've known how far the Earth is from the sun. And throughout the entire history of the discipline of astrophysics, astrophysicists assumed that Earth was right in the middle of the habitable zone for a sun of our size, of our energy. So we thought Earth was right in the middle of that green zone, but as it turns out, a paper from a couple of years ago points out that we're within 1% of the inner edge of the habitable zone. What this suggests is that relatively minor changes in atmospheric chemistry could be sufficient to push us out of the habitable zone. The bad news is we haven't made minor changes in atmospheric chemistry on this planet. We've made major changes in atmospheric chemistry on this planet. We've increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by more than 40% since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We increased methane concentrations in the atmosphere by more than 250% in that same period of time. Methane is more than 100 times more powerful a greenhouse gas, molecule for molecule in the short term. So if we just consider those two from among a handful of greenhouse gases, we just consider carbon dioxide and methane, then we're at the equivalent of more than 650 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So remember when 350 was the Rubicon we could not cross? 280 parts per million is the maximum ever experienced by humans before the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We got to 350. James Hansen and colleagues said we can't go any further. Now we're at 400. All the climate scientists say we can go to 450 now and that'll be safe. Well, we're at the equivalent of 650, just including methane. At what point do we stop saying it's all going to be okay? So Sam Carana, climate blogger, suggests that exponential release of methane into the atmosphere has actually triggered runaway greenhouse, and that line indicated by the number 2 has us following Venus's example in the relatively near future, with a 4-degree temperature rise by 2030 and a 10-degree temperature rise by 2040 and so on, right up to boiling the oceans by 2080 or something like that. So it could be, we don't know. We don't know whether the planetary temperature is going to stabilize at that hot state as it has in the past, or whether it's going to keep right on going up. And we don't understand enough about those negative feedbacks that cause the temperature to turn down. We don't know enough about those to even suggest when those might kick in or what causes them to kick in. So that's one of 50 irreversible self-reinforcing feedback loops. They not only feed upon themselves, they feed among each other as well. So that one was reported in 2009. There's a little hiatus in the scientific community before a few more were reported in 2011. Among them, the sublimation of peat in the world's boreal forests, as peat essentially turns from solid form to vapor in a short period of time. So as it gets warmer and drier in the world's boreal forests, the peat sublimates, carbon dioxide is kicked directly into the atmosphere. That increases carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which causes it to be warmer and drier in the world's boreal forests. Other self-reinforcing feedback loops, and you'd have to be not paying attention by design to have not noticed that the permafrost is melting all over the world. Most notably in the region of Russia, known as Yamal, where those big craters have appeared within the last year or two. And those big craters have 50,000 times the level of methane as is, quote, normally found in the atmosphere. Yamal, interpreted from the Russian, means the end of the world. So what a great place for those methane craters to show up. And so these things all interact with each other and make the situation far worse than it otherwise would be. The human response is expressed by Farley Mowat, writing not about climate change, but in general, the human response to the Thelma and Louise condition, or the Wile E. Coyote condition over the cliff. We're under some gross misconception that we're a good species going somewhere important, and at the last minute we'll correct our errors and God will smile on us. It's delusion. Not only is it delusion, but we're well past the last minute. I don't know when the last minute was. It might have been 1939 when we built the first nuclear reactors. It might have been 2007 when it appears we fired the Clathrate gun. It might have been several thousand years ago when civilizations first developed around the planet after 2.8 million years of the genus Homo. It might have been when we crawled out of the trees. It might have been when we first started using fire and language. But at some point, we were past the point of no return, and with respect to climate, it appears we passed that point in 2007 or maybe even sooner. The situation for our species is much the same as it is for individuals. So that little YouTube clip that I started with, the baby comes out of the womb and then a full 45 seconds later, the old man crashes into the earth. Life is short. So that applies not at the level of individuals, but to species as well. All species go extinct. Even if we persist, if Homo sapiens persists another few thousand years, it appears we will be extinct and will last about 1/7 as long as the typical species of mammal on Earth. So, here's the history of humans, incorrectly, misogynistically noted as the history of man in this slide. We show up as a species, we take a few looks around, we blink 7 times, and the end. We don't have long. It's later than you think. People always ask me, what should they do? I don't have any idea what the hell I'm doing. I don't know why people ask me that question. And I don't believe in should anymore. If somebody is going to follow their dreams, I would encourage those dreams to be rooted in reality at the very least. As Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman points out, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. And this line was written in Feynman's report about the disaster that was the Space Shuttle Challenger, in which the government tried to use public relations to obscure the reality of the situation. And the governments of the world and the corporate media of the world, in my opinion, are doing the same thing now. They are obscuring the message about abrupt climate change, but ultimately reality, or nature, bats last. I would be remiss not to finish like a Hollywood movie, that is, with really good news. So I have really good news. We get to die. It sounds so bad because we're such a death-denying, death-defying, grief-denying culture. We just don't want to go there. In fact, perhaps the most famous climate scientist working today, Michael Mann, was asked on Facebook, so it must be true, "What do you think about near-term human extinction, Dr. Mann?" And Michael Mann responded with, "I can't go there, Kevin." What does that mean? As a scientist, you can't go there. As a father, you can't go there. As a paid university researcher, you can't go there. What does that mean, you can't go there? The good news associated with we get to die is that we get to live. We know a lot about DNA. We understand DNA well enough now to know that the odds against any one of us being here in physical form, the odds against that happening exceed the odds against you buying a single lottery ticket every week and winning every week for 10 years. In fact, it's not even close. The odds against you being here are truly cosmological. The odds against you being here in physical form, based on your DNA and our understanding of DNA, exceed the odds against plucking a single atom from the entire universe at random. It's kind of a big deal that we're here. And yet we act like we're going to live forever. We're always planning for the future. We're almost never appreciating what we have. We get to live. We, you and me, these physical forms showed up. We get to. It's not a have to kind of thing. Living is not like going to work at your shitty job, right? You don't get up in the morning and say, "Oh man, I have to go to work. I mean, I have to live again. God damn it, if only if I didn't have to live. If there was a way out of this, I'm sure I'd take it." No, it's not like that. We get to live. It's an enormous privilege. And we have it even better. We live in the global north. Every time we flip a switch, the light comes on. Every single time. Every time we push a lever, water comes through the taps. Every single time. Every time we go to the grocery store, there's so much food there that a third of it in this country gets thrown away before it's eaten. Every single time. We get to live. And so, of course, the obvious end of that, the part of the whole natural process of living, is we get to die too. So we don't talk about that part. Evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins points out in the teeth of these stupefying odds against you and I being here, it is you and I that are privileged to be here, privileged with eyes to see where we are and brains to wonder why. What he's saying is we get to live against truly cosmological odds. We get to be here with the eyes to see where we are and the brains to wonder why. It's pretty awesome. And we're so privileged that we can go onto a digital device we can hold in our hand, and it has more computing power than would have filled this room 30 years ago with a computer. We can take that device in our hand and we can check and we can see in 30 seconds that what I'm telling you is actually true. That the odds against any of us being here are truly cosmological. And then we can go that next step and we can find out that we live in a universe that doesn't have any moral standard about any species, much less any individual, being here. The universe really couldn't care about us as a species or us as individuals. It's amazing and incredible that we showed up, and yet really in the grand scheme of things, we're a speck on a worthless little piece of lint-covered speck. So we can hold in our brains, our incredibly complex brains, these two thoughts simultaneously. We're miracles that we showed up at all, and we're really nothing in the cosmological scheme of things. Or as my friend Derek Jensen says, our brains are complicated enough to hold in them two thoughts simultaneously. One, life is wonderful, and two, we're really fucked. Yeah, and our lives are truly wonderful. Right? Ice in the drink, temperature always 70 degrees. It's awesome. It's incredibly privileged the way we live. But we don't live forever. Let's act like we don't live forever. When we head into the abyss, essentially nobody on their deathbed says, I should have bought more crap. I just don't see a lot of this. Yeah, I don't think anybody, when they're taking their final breaths, is thinking, I'm truly, really miserable, and I'd have been so happy if I'd have had 12 more pairs of shoes. If I'd have had one more Lamborghini in my collection, then I'd have been happy, but I'm not. No, I suspect almost everybody, when they draw their last breaths, is instead thinking something like this. Something like, I don't want you to save the world, I just want you to put your arms around me when it ends. I suspect that essentially everybody on the planet, and certainly everybody in this room, is not so concerned about the monetary system, at least not when they face their death, but instead is concerned with the moments of joy to which they contributed, the pain they alleviated along the way, the time they spent with those they love. Those are the things that matter, and yet we always act as if there's tomorrow. As the Buddha said some 2,600 years ago, the trouble is, you think there's time. I tell that to my wife, and she says, 2,600 years ago? Really? So we had quite a bit of time, I'd guess. This is the trouble, being married to smart women. I wouldn't recommend it. So what do we do then? How do we act, given that our lives are short, that our run as a species is short? How do we show up? Well, I suggest two things, and this is why I'm almost never asked to speak on college campuses anymore, because this is going straight from science, the data indicating near-term human extinction, or more correctly, the near-term loss of habitat for our species. And I start talking about what the science leads me to suggest. And what I suggest is pursuing a couple of things that we spend little time talking about in this culture. Pursuing what you love and pursuing a life of excellence. Now, I don't know what a life of excellence means to you. I know what it means for me, and it took me a long time to get there. So I don't have a lot of advice about how you pursue excellence in your life. But it's one of those things that we almost never talk about in this culture. So you might actually want to think about it, how you want to spend your life and your life's pursuits in whatever your version of excellence is. And I know for Jamie Dimon and Lloyd Blankfein and those folks, the pursuit of excellence really means the pursuit of money. But I doubt that applies to anybody in here. And I doubt any of us are thinking as we take our final breaths that we'd have been so much happier with another ruby necklace, right? Yes, we're material beings, especially in the global north, especially those of us who live lives of relative privilege. But I doubt if any of us in our final moments are thinking about that last material possession we could have had, and instead are thinking about those we love, the things we wish we had done, and our pursuit of excellence. And the same applies at the level of the individual day. You know, if I look back on the day and I think, did I do something good today? Was I kind to somebody? Was I compassionate with somebody? Did I help somebody through a difficult time in their day? For me, that's an excellent day. For some people, an excellent day might be pushing that old woman out of the way so you get the last copy of the Xbox on the shelf. I can't define that for you. So I get this a lot. Actually, I almost never get this. I get just the final two words followed by an exclamation mark. He's wrong. He must be wrong because nobody else is saying this. And all I'm really doing here is presenting other people's data. I haven't presented a single bit of evidence that I came up with on my own, because I stopped conducting research more than 6 years ago. Now I'm just reporting the research conducted by other people and connecting a few dots. By the way, if all the data are wrong, if all the forecasts are wrong, if all the models are wrong, if all the scenarios are wrong, oh, and by the way, the International Energy Agency, the most business-as-usual conservative organization on the planet, as near as I can tell, predicts up to a 6-degree centigrade temperature rise by 2050. So this is what Paul Beckwith uses as partial justification for his decade or two prediction about temperature rise, because he's just adding methane into the mix. The International Energy Agency doesn't even consider methane or any of these self-reinforcing feedback loops. They're just talking about carbon dioxide to get us to 6C in 35 short years. But even if they're all wrong, even if the International Energy Agency wrong, and Paul Beckwith is wrong, and Natalia Shikova is wrong, and we're not actually outstripping the ability of organisms to keep up by a factor of 10,000 times, I still have really good news. We still get to die. And that means we get to live. We, those very few privileged of us, get to live. It's pretty awesome if you think about it, and that's why most people don't. In March of this year, just a couple of months ago, the world's oldest human being turned 117 years, and when she was asked to ponder those last 117 years, she said, and I quote, "It seemed rather short." I couldn't ask for a better endorsement. See, I told you so. For years I've been saying, even if you live to be 100, it's going to seem rather short. Well, I was underestimating as usual. Things are going faster than expected. My favorite headline lately. When it comes to climate change, I see it almost every day. Ice disappearing in Antarctica, faster than expected. I saw a newspaper article a few years ago about that U.S. Naval College postgraduate college report about the Arctic being ice-free in 2016. And the headline says, 84 years ahead of schedule. I'm like, nature had a schedule? And she didn't tell us? Worthless. Never mind. Faster than expected. That's the whole story. And so this woman lives to be 117. She says it seemed rather short, thereby demonstrating my first point, that even if you live to be 100, it's not going to seem like a very long time. And then to put an exclamation mark on my whole story here, she died a few weeks later. See? Birth is lethal. I told you nobody gets out alive, and it's going to seem rather short. Let's create those moments of joy. Let's act with urgency. Let's live with urgency. It's such a simple message. If you want more of that simple message, I think some copies of my recent book are going to show up at some point, and I will sign them for you. If you want the data part of the story, it's all in this link, guymcpherson.com/climate chaos. So if you're just interested in the data, and How exciting could it be, right? You get to go even deeper. It could take you hours to read this one essay and click all the links and find out that all the people I'm citing actually said these things I said. And maybe you'll come out liberated, and maybe you'll come out depressed. And either way, if you want the other side of the story, the book with Carolyn Baker, Extinction Dialogues, it provides some suggestions about how we might live. And the whole story really is in the subtitle, which you probably can't even see from there, 7 words, How to Live with Death in Mind. This is probably an apocryphal story, but I'm going to tell it anyway because 2,600 years later, who's going to correct me? Apparently the Buddha asked one of his students, how frequently do you think about death? And the student said, oh man, I think about death all the time. And he probably said it just like that because he was a premature hippie. Oh man, I think about it all the time. I probably think about death 20 times a day. And the Buddha said, 20 times a day, that's not enough. You must think about death with every breath. That might be a little macabre for most people. But life is short. Live with urgency. Again, I reiterate that action is the antidote to despair and a good measure of our character regardless whether we despair or not. If you are interested in pursuing these topics further and visiting with other people about how you might proceed, I have a couple of suggestions. One of them is to sign up on the piece of paper that's on the back of at the back of the room on your way out. There's a piece of paper that asks for your name and email address, and support groups frequently form in my wake. And these are groups that people agree to get together every whatever day of the week, at whatever time, at whatever place, and sit around and talk about the unspeakable. And many other things as well. As near as I can tell, nobody sits around and acts mopey and depressed. Instead, they found people who are willing to have conversations about important topics. And so the topic need not linger on the evidence, and almost never does. Instead, it's looking for those people who are willing to ponder what this culture ignores, what this culture considers taboo, which is grief and grieving and death and dying and all those nasty little details we must attend to at the end of our lives. Or rather, somebody else must. And then the second example is a workshop I've put together with a colleague, Pauline Schneider, and you can find out a whole bunch more about that at onlyloveremains.org. The bottom line, the take-home message here is that we, you and me, we have in our hands enormous power and, paradoxically, no power at all. We can't stop irreversible climate change. We can't stop the decay of industrial civilization. We can't stop in time the meltdown of nuclear power facilities. All of these things are beyond our control as individuals. We feel powerless. But we have enormous power in how we conduct our lives and with whom we spend our time. And I would argue that's all we really ever had control over. Who do we spend our time with? How do we spend that time? You have enormous power as an individual to influence a relatively few people in your life. You get to spend time with a relatively few people on a daily basis. You interact with relatively few people on a daily basis. And you can punch those people in the face every day, or you can act with compassion. You can bring joy to the lives of those around you, or you cannot. You can be the guy who trips the grandmother and knocks her down to get the last Xbox on the shelf for your 8-year-old child. Or you cannot. So this is enormously powerful, and I would argue that how we act with each other in our tribes is a measure of our character, a measure of our power, and an indication of our responsibility. It's our responsibility to act in ways that humans are capable of acting, to bring out the best of human behavior at the end of the movie. I would argue as well that it's not just a responsibility, it's not just a source of power, but it's an honor and a privilege to act with decency and respect to those around us. Thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to entertain a question or two. Thank you.